Good evening. Welcome to the second event in the Leaving Canada Speaker Series, hosted by the Centre for Transnational Mennonite Studies at the University of Winnipeg and Mennonite Heritage Village with support from the Plett Foundation. Before we begin the program tonight, I want to acknowledge that MHV and CTMS are located on Treaty 1 territory, the ancestral and traditional territories of the Anishinaabe, Inishinu, Assiniboine, Cree, Dene, and the heartland of the Métis Nation. My name is Andrea Clausen, and I'm the Senior Curator at MHV, a history museum located in Steinbach, Manitoba, that seeks to preserve and exhibit the history of Russian descendant Mennonites in Canada. This year, Mennonite Heritage Village has partnered with the Plett Foundation and the Mennonite Historical Society of Canada to commemorate the 100th anniversary of the migration of Mennonites to Mexico with an exhibit entitled Leaving Canada, the Mennonite Migration to Mexico, which you can see in the screen behind me. The exhibit explores the reasons traditionalist Mennonites left Canada, what they encountered when they arrived and built new settlements in Mexico, and what this migration means for us today. This speaker series follows these themes, but it also gives us a chance to dig a little deeper into some of the topics we weren't able to address in detail in the exhibit. So I'm looking forward to hearing from each of the presentations we have planned throughout the summer and fall. Stick around for the end of tonight's presentation, when I'll give you the details of the next event planned in this series. Tonight's speaker is Kevin Dyck, and his talk is entitled Putting Down Roots in Mexico. Before we begin, I have a few housekeeping notes. Kevin's presentation will be followed by a question and answer session. So if you have questions for him that come to your mind as he's talking, be sure to write those in the Q&A tab at the bottom of your screen. Don't write them in the chat. I won't be watching that because I can't watch that many things at one time. So put them in the Q&A and we'll get to those after his presentation. This event is also being recorded and we will post the video on the CTMS and MHV websites and YouTube channels. And now without further delay, let's get to the presentation tonight. I'm delighted to introduce Kevin Dyck, who is the director of Museo Menonita in Cuauhtémoc, Chihuahua, Mexico. Kevin studied financial administration at the Autonomous University of Chihuahua. After finishing his university studies, he started and developed a program for a prestigious hospital dedicated to facilitating medical care for the Mennonite community with the purpose of improving the limitations of language and comprehension. He is the director of the Mennonite Museum in Mexico. During his 4 years in this position, he has encouraged this cultural center to host events that represent and preserve the identity of the Mennonite community in Mexico and promote reliable and well-founded information about culture and religion. During the last year, he has also participated as Director of Communication of the 100th anniversary of Mennonites in Mexico. And he told me just before we came on the air today that he's fourth generation Mennonite born in Mexico, and that his great grandparents, he can correct me, came from Canada in the migration in the 1920s. So Kevin, we're looking forward to hearing from you. So I'll hand it over to you.
Hi, thank you. I'm very excited to be here and thank you for the invitation. I'll quickly share my screen with some of the talking points. Okay, there we go. So yeah, my talk for tonight is putting down roots in Mexico. As Andrea mentioned, I am, well, fourth generation of Mennonite living in Mexico, but born in Mexico, I'm the third one. So yeah, I want to focus my talk in three main stages. The first one being, why did in the first place Mennonites leave Canada? The second one, why did they choose Mexico? And the third, a little bit about the challenges that the community has faced throughout these last 100 years. So the first topic, why did Mennonites actually leave Canada? So one of the goals was to preserve specifically the educational school model. Canada, back in the time when the Mennonites were established in Canada, had a situation with nationalism. Canada was a relatively new country or new nation that a lot of immigrants, went to live there. There was a lot of foreign people, and Canada didn't really have a national sentiment. So Canada tried to build this nationalism through the school system, get involved in the materials, get involved with the teachers, and ultimately build a sense of Canadian citizenship. So Mennonites also experienced this with their schools. They started to see that the government got involved. They wanted to see the materials. They wanted to have involvement in the teacher process. So this is a topic that the Mennonite community was very preoccupied with and was worried that they would end up with a very different educational model. So Mennonite schools are very different than other schools because they build a very specific identity, which is the Mennonite identity and our traditions and customs, and also our religion. The Mennonite religion is also taught in school. So these two things were very important to the community and are still to this day. And this is what they feared they would lose if they didn't leave Canada at this point. So they started seeking other countries that would allow them to fully have, and it says my internet connection is unstable, but if otherwise, I'll just continue. Yeah, one of these countries that agreed to the terms that the Mennonite community sought was Mexico. And Mexico also had a very interesting characteristics, which was they wanted to build the agricultural evolution of the country. They wanted to increase Mexico's production and invite farming communities to establish themselves in Mexico. And they knew the Mennonite community was a farming community mostly. So that was of interest of the Mexican government. So the agreement that the community had with the Mexican government had 5 points or 5 agreements. The first one being there was no obligation to a military service. As we know, the Mennonite community along history has been a pacifist community. So this was of most importance to the community. The second one, in no case will they be forced, in this sense, the Mennonite community, forced to take an oath. So this is based on the biblical teachings that we have, that we shouldn't take an oath. The third one being religious freedom, which is also a very, very important topic. As we know, the schools are very strictly tied to religion. So a religious freedom was also very important for the community. And the fourth one was, which I believe was the one that really impulsed the community to move forward with this immigration to Mexico, which is the one that you are fully, like the community, authorized to found your own schools with your own teachers, without the government obstructing you in any way. So this agreement secured what the Mennonite community in Canada feared, which was the government getting involved in the school system. And the fifth one, freedom of economic regime and social organization, which nowadays we all also have. And this was the 5 points that the Mexican government agreed with the Mennonite community, and then ultimately was signed as a promise to the Mennonite community to be kept in the future. So now that we know why the Mennonite community left Canada and how they ended up being in Mexico, I have this third part of the topic of putting down roots, which is putting down roots on a dry and hard soil. I want to talk about 3 interesting challenges that the community faced. And the first one that I want to talk about is also related to the topic of education. Back in 1937, there were two school inspectors from the Mexican government that accused the Mennonite schools of teaching religion, which was true, but it was an agreement that our community had with the government. But the argument of these two school inspectors was that no one was above the law, not even the Mennonite community, not even an agreement of the federal government. So they managed to get an order to close down the schools. And this in a context where the education in Mexico has three very important characteristics, which the education in Mexico, sorry, must be secular, no religion, free, and mandatory. So the Mennonite schools violated the first characteristic, which was secular. So they managed to close down the schools. So what did the community do? They sent Minister Abraham Dyck, which is my great-grandfather, and the chief of the colony in that time, or Vorsteher, as we know it in Mexico, Gerhard Rempel, to go to Mexico City and talk with the Board of Education and kind of remind them that we had this agreement and that they should honor it and send an order back to these two inspectors and reopen the schools, because that was the important aspect of which we in the first place came to Mexico. So it was very important that they should keep their promise on this agreement. So they did. They returned with an official letter of the federal government with the order that these inspectors should reopen the schools and let them continue with the education process. But they still kept on with their argument, which was nobody is above the law. And ultimately, there had to be an order signed directly from the president to reopen these schools, and they finally did. But it was a long process. And as I write down in the last one, if the government wouldn't keep the agreement on education, it would be most likely that our community would have probably left Mexico. So this was an interesting challenge that they faced, and that is a center point of our evolution and growth in Mexico. The second topic in challenges that I want to talk about, is titled Farming in Chihuahua's Desert. Canada and Chihuahua have a very different weather. So the weather conditions that the community faced were very, very different than back at home in Canada. So the crops that they planted, which were mainly wheat and oats, was a failure. There was not enough water to sustain these type of crops. And added to that, Mexico had very, very strong agricultural crisis in the 40s and 50s. So there was an agricultural crisis also in the community. Many people say that if Mennonites would have only stuck with agriculture, the community in Mexico would have probably failed. So what did some families notice? Well, there was enough forage from the wheat crops to feed the cows. There was not enough to commercialize the grain and get a profit from that part, but they noticed it was enough to feed the cows and keep the cows giving milk. So they also discovered that Mexico had a very high demand for cheese. Mennonites had been producing cheese at home since generations before, but they hadn't really commercialized it. But they saw this opportunity in Mexico to keep the cows and produce milk and sell cheese and build a stable economy through the dairy industry. So they started cooperative societies as cheese factories. So the idea was that each neighbor would provide milk for the cheese factory, and there would be a common production where not all of them should have made the investment for the cheese factory. It would be a communal investment, which allowed them to produce and to sell to the Mexico market of cheese. And that's where the dairy industry that nowadays is very familiar between Mexico and the Mennonites grew out of, because of an agricultural crisis. But many say that it saved the community economically and allowed them to continue their stay in Mexico. And the third challenge that I want to talk about is one that showcases how the Mennonite community interacts with other cultures and other societies where they immigrate. So there was a situation when the Mennonites bought the land from the Zuluaga family. There was a promise of the Zuluaga familia, that they would relocate. There were these ejidos, which were agrarian social properties of little farmers. The familia Zuluaga would relocate these to another part of the land that they also owned, that were not the land that was sold to the Mennonites. They would relocate these ejidos, but for the first years, nothing happened. The family didn't relocate them. It was a whole topic. So the Mennonites went to the authorities and asked for them to investigate this issue. So a government commission was formed specifically to investigate this situation where the Zuluaga family had agreed to or promised to relocate these ejidos, but they didn't. So there started to be rumors where they said that the Mexican government wanted to interfere with the migration of the Mennonites, which was not true. But a lot of rumors like these started, and also that Mennonites they just wanted the Zuluaga family to fulfill their agreement because they bought the land, and this was one of the promises. So the next step that they took upon was that the Mennonite leaders went to talk to the governor of Chihuahua. Again, after this, nothing happened. And at this time, when they visited the governor of Chihuahua, they invited Walter Schmiedhaus, which was a representative of the Germany in Cuauhtémoc, and they invited them into this meeting that they had with the governor to talk about this issue. And they noticed the government officials really listened when Walter Schmiedhaus was with them. So they commissioned Walter Schmiedhaus to go to Mexico City and resolve this issue with the Zuluaga family and the ejidos. And I think this example of a resolution of a challenge really reflects how we as a community try to resolve conflict. Very lawful, very in a pacifist way, through the government officials that are responsible to resolve the issue, and never taking action that could be violent or aggressive, or it is always seeked to do it the right way, the righteous way and the lawful way. So I believe this challenge and the resolution of it really showcases how in these last 100 years, the Mennonites have faced different problems, but have always sought to resolve them in the most respectful, lawful way that it could be possible. So yeah, putting down roots in Mexico is what I thought could be divided in these different topics. Andrea also asked me if I could share a little bit about our museum and why there is a museum in Mexico and how it started. So I'm not going to go in a lot of detail, but for the 57th anniversary, there was a big celebration organized. And the celebration was organized in such a way that there could be a profit, a little profit, which would go half and half into two projects. The first half into an elderly home, which is Altenheim, that it's an association that still exists and runs. And the second one would be a fund to start a Mennonite museum. So that's where the idea started from. And later on, the Rempel brothers donated the land, which upon it was constructed and built. So that was the beginning of the museum. It was founded, the association was founded in 2000, and the first exhibition of the museum was built in 2001, or finished building in 2001 when it opened its doors. And there was a lot of increasing tourism in the 2000s, and a lot of people were interested in knowing about our culture. So I believe the idea of having half of this profit set for a fund to establish a museum was really inspired by the interest of different Mexican communities in getting to know us. Nowadays, we have visitors from all over the country who are very excited to learn about our culture. We are also excited to share with them our characteristics and our history. And I believe that's where the idea emerged as a obligation to the people that are interested in knowing about us. So there's a place that can teach them and can guide them through our culture, and maybe they can learn something from it. So yeah, that was the talk that I have planned for today, and I guess we'll go into a Q&A after this.
Thanks, Kevin. Let me just close this blind behind me here. So we have some questions coming in, but I also have some of my own here. So just to get it kind of started out and let people get some time to write their questions in or formulate your question in your mind. You talked about the main goal of the migration being to preserve culture, religious freedom, and you mentioned 5 different privileges that were part of Mennonites migrating to Mexico. Looking back over the last century, do you think this goal of preserving culture and religion has been met in Mexico? And are there places where Mennonites have lost their roots during these 100 years? You live in Canada for a certain period of time, and then 50 years after they arrive, they say, "Oh, we can't do this because we're going to lose, X, Y, and Z. Let's go to Mexico." Did that happen again? Did that process happen in Mexico? Can you talk a bit more about that?
So far as I know, in terms of education, this incident in 1937 was the only real threat to this agreement. Mm-hmm. So far as I know, in all our 100 years, this was the only time when one of these agreements was kind of took aside or didn't fully protect our community. But ultimately, it is an agreement with the Mexican federal government, so they have to honor it. But yeah, I think this incident, so far as I know, is the only one where these agreements were really not respected. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Okay, it's quite impressive that over a century the agreement still stands. In Canada, mm-hmm. There's been many times where the government has looked at this what Mennonites would call the privilegium, the Charter of Rights, and say, no, I know we said this, but actually you're going to have to join the military unless you can, prove otherwise or something. So that's quite interesting. So just looking at the Q&A, and again, for folks who have questions for Kevin, please write that in the Q&A tab at the bottom. If you put your question in the chat, it gets lost in there. Barbara asks, for those of us doing genealogical research on our Mexican Mennonite ancestors, where can we search for records? And she says, aside from places like Grandma Online, for example. Do you have sources for her?
I was just gonna talk about Grandma. There are not a lot of public online records other than Grandma that I know of. We have some archives internally, but are very specific to the communities in Mexico and are not available online. So I believe if one wanted to access online a formal database, I think Grandma would be the place that I would go to.
Mm-hmm. What about the, I don't know the exact titles, I know where they are in my office at the museum, but the Gemeindebuchs, like of the different congregations. I mean, that doesn't answer the question of, the last 100 years, but at least for the generations who left to Mexico, Barbara, that might be an idea. And those I think were published by the Manitoba Mennonite Historical Society. They have like burgundy covers.
Yeah, that's not a bad idea. I believe most churches would have a family book where they would display all their members and their information. So that could be one. Also, I know that a lot of families have their family book. I know from my dad's side, there's a Rempels book that traces the families back to, I think the Rempels book that we have traces them back to the Cornelius Rempel, one of the delegates.
Okay.
That was sent to Mexico.
Yeah.
So I think there's different family books that trace the genealogy back to different ancestors, but I think that could be a very good source of information too.
Yeah,
I know a lot of families put a lot of effort in investigating and researching, and I know in my family was this Rempels book, and I know it's a very, very useful and very resourceful book. That could also be a good source.
Yeah, those might be hard to find because they're usually like privately published or self-published. But Barbara, if you can find like a library who has a good section like that, maybe, I don't know. I know we have a lot of those at the museum as well in our library. Dan Jansen asks, how many Mennonites are there these days? Oh, he has lots of questions. How many Mennonites are there these days in Mexico? Are they still predominantly farmers? And what other forms of economic activity do they engage in? So 3 questions in one.
Sure. Well, the population is an estimate. There is a government office which is called the INEGI, which makes these census to know the population. But it's tricky with a community which has a particular religion and ethnicity. And I believe most of these forms that the INEGI sends out don't include specifically if it's a Mennonite of religion or Mennonite of ethnicity or both. So all of the numbers that we have are estimates, and the estimates are, well, firstly, we can talk about our Manitoba Colony, which is the first one and the biggest one. And there's an estimate of between 25 and 30,000 Mennonites in this colony. Then we can go and talk about the state of Chihuahua, which is an estimate of 50,000. And then we could talk about Mexico as a country, and there is an estimated population of 100,000. So those would be the population numbers, but are very rough. It's not a very exact number. And I forgot the second part of the question.
Are Mennonites still predominantly farmers?
Farmers. Approximately between 60 to 70% of the economy of the community is still built up in agriculture.
Okay.
The other 30% is already, one would say, corredor comercial, which is the highway with all the businesses. So a lot of commerce, a lot of selling used machines, different industries like the dairy industry are also part of these 30%. But yeah, most of the community, over 50%, still is involved in agriculture.
Okay. And that was one of the questions that I had as well. So you talked about how Mennonites adapted their agriculture when they first arrived in Mexico, starting the cheese industry or incorporating different crops. What is their main farming? Like, if most of them are still involved in farming today, what does that look like today? Is it still
it depends on the colony. Specifically, if we talk about the Manitoba Colony, there's two crops, corn and then apples.
Okay.
So yeah, most of the farmers would either have corn fields or apple. Yeah,
orchard?
Those are the two. But there are colonies such as oases more northern of the state, which would have a lot of cotton.
Okay. And when did cotton and apples kind of start?
Oof.
Like, when did that sort of take off? I know when I visited the colony in December 2019, that wasn't the time to see all the apples out there, but you could see there's tons of apple orchards, and you could see that was a very big industry. Was there a time where Mennonites kind of transitioned into that industry?
I believe there is a specific man or family that introduced the apple. I can recall the name from my top of my head, but I believe it was a specific person that brought in the apple trees. And I know that most of the people here didn't believe that would be a popular crop. Like, people didn't believe in apples as an economic growth crop, but they proved them wrong. And like, not only in our community, apples in the whole state of Chihuahua is, I believe the state of Chihuahua has the highest apple production in the country. So we as a Mennonite community have a lot, but Mexican communities also have a lot of apples. So Chihuahua is characterized as a land where apples are very delicious.
Okay.
And cotton,
yeah,
as far as I know, since the beginning of communities northern of the state near Ojinaga, they have always grown cotton, so far as I know. I had one of my dad's brothers moved to Oasis, and he also had cotton. And from what I know, cotton was one of the primary crops in those areas. And I believe it's because of the soil and the weather conditions. I believe those two aspects are the ones that allow cotton to grow very good.
Okay, interesting. Shifting gears entirely here, Linda Thiessen asks, could you elaborate on and explain how it was possible for the Zuloaga family to sell land to Mennonites and promise to relocate ejido members when the land was held by Mexican state, not individuals?
Oh, wow. Okay.
Or maybe a little bit like, what was that situation like when they got there? Even the what isn't ejido.
I'm not entirely sure how the Zuluaga family, had the right to, because, well, technically they own the land, and the government kind of forced them into building these little farmer communities. And how they would have authority over them, that I don't know. I only know that the agreement when selling the land was this topic specifically.
Okay. And that was one of the topics that I found very interesting. So when Mennonites are moving from Canada to Mexico, they're, you know, this pacifist Anabaptist group, they're moving into territory that was right in the middle of the Mexican Revolution. I mean, the revolution had ended, but just barely when they arrived. So is this situation with the ejidos part of the tensions between Mennonites and the peasant land reformers, the agoristas? How did that work for Mennonites when they first came there? What was that like?
Yeah, I guess Mennonites were in between a fire that was going on between these families with a lot of land and these agricultural movements. And I don't believe the Mennonite community thought it would be a big deal at the time.
Okay.
I guess they believed the family. I guess they believed the family did have the authority over the ejidos, and it would be a simple movement and a simple rearrangement, but it turned out to be very much difficult than that. So that's something they learned along the way.
Okay. It's very interesting history, and a lot of those early years in Mexico are very difficult because they're moving into this situation that's very in flux right after the revolution there. Barbara asks, what do you see are the biggest challenges that the what do you see are the biggest challenges that the Mexican Mennonite community face now and going into the future?
Okay. I think if we talk in terms of economic growth, I think water would be a very interesting topic, because without water, our agricultural growth as a community would decrease incredibly. So I think the topic of water and how much we need to produce is an interesting challenge. I would say that part. In terms of, I think that will be one of the main ones. Okay. Other than that, I don't see a lot of conflict evolving. Okay. So access to water for their farming is huge. Yep. Let me see here. There's a question here about education. Are the Mennonites of Mexico open to continued education in a university capacity? So I guess what's the attitude toward higher education there? In terms of education, there's been an interesting evolution in the different churches that our community has. School and education is very tied to the churches and their religion. So schools progress in a way that the religion and the churches also evolve. There's a couple of churches that have sought progress in their school programs. One example is the Álvaro Obregón School, which was the first school incorporated into the Mexican education system. And our church and our school have always thought that school has to progress, has to evolve, has to adapt. And that is the mission of the school, to prepare our children, our youth, to build a better world. And that's the focus also of the school programs. So university studies are very much encouraged. So that is the focus of some, and not of all of them. I believe some communities and some churches see it as a step that the children and the youth have to pass. but not really as a tool to a better life. So yeah, it's very different depending on the church and school that we're talking about. So everybody has a different focus, but there are schools that always are looking forward to building better programs, to offering their students more or interesting classes and more broad classes and technical careers, and encourage them to sign into universities in Cuauhtémoc, in Chihuahua, in the States, in Canada. Yeah.
Okay. When I was visiting in 2019, I was interested to see how many different types of school there were. So I think the school you're mentioning, if I'm remembering right, that school looked very much like the elementary school that I would have gone to. You know, student artwork on the walls, the desks are set up in the same way. There's lots of colorful stuff around. But we also visited a private school as well. So it was very interesting to me that there's these two systems that kind of operate in tandem in the community. Are there tensions in the community around the topic of education, seeing as it was so important for them leaving Canada to come to Mexico to begin with?
Yeah, I believe not everybody looks at education the same way. And there's been a division also in that topic. A lot of people have sought to improve and progress and build better schools with better programs, and others have tried to keep the same school system that has been around for generations. And those are different focuses, and ultimately they divide themselves. And for example, our school, Álvaro Obregón, it seeks to improve itself, but not without losing our traditions, our culture. It's never the purpose to change, more like to improve.
Okay.
So our schools still teach, like they have the normal Mexican education courses, and added to that we have language courses, we have Bible classes, Mennonite studies, Anabaptist studies. So that's additional to a program in order to preserve these aspects that are also very important to the education in our schools.
Interesting. That kind of leads into another question we had from someone here. What's the language that Mennonites speak in Mexico?
Okay. Well, most of the people would talk Plotich.
Okay.
And most of the schools would teach to write and read in German.
Okay.
So formally in written and when one reads books, it would be in German, but orally it would be mostly Plotich.
Okay.
And Spanish. In the traditional school system, they wouldn't teach Spanish. In schools like Álvaro Obregón, they would already have Spanish classes. It depends on the schools, but most people would know a little bit of Spanish because of living in Mexico.
Okay, interesting. Ron asks, I grew up in Leamington, Ontario. Mennonites from Mexico have been coming to the area since the 1960s. Initially, they arrived as temporary agricultural workers in the summer and then returned to Mexico for the winter. Later, over decades, many of these people settled permanently in the area. One of the motives for this migration was economic. Were there other motives as well?
Can you repeat the first part of the question?
Yeah, so he's talking about Leamington, Ontario, and he says, you know, they first started coming back there or moved there in the 1960s, but first as temporary agricultural workers, but then the settlement became permanent. Were there other motivating factors?
Yeah, I guess the economic growth of the community has had its I personally also have family that has gone back to Canada because of economic reasons. And I think it's the case with a lot of families where Mexico didn't allow them to develop maybe certain industry or certain company or maybe agriculture wasn't picking up. So I believe there is a lot of families that because of the economic factor, tried going back to Canada and looking for other opportunities. I think that's the case for most families. I believe it's the case for some of my family too. And yeah, I don't think there's another specific reason that they would have to go back to Canada. But yeah, the economic part, I think it's a very very important one.
There's another question here from Dave and Rose Phrase. They say, my grandparents returned to Canada after approximately 1 year. Were there others who returned to Mexico, I guess, in that early period? And do you know how many?
Yeah, there were a lot of families that returned. I don't know how many. I know that not the majority. If not, we wouldn't have like grown the community in Mexico. But I think there were a lot, like some families that returned to Canada. How much? I don't know exactly.
Yeah, I don't know that answer either, but I do know that we have artifacts that came from the community that are in the exhibit of families who returned very quickly. 1925, They go right back to where they came from in Manitoba. So it seems that if they left in the early days, they often went back to where they came from in Manitoba and Saskatchewan. Later on, if they're returning to Canada, they return very often to Southern Ontario, Southern Manitoba as well. But I don't know the number on that either.
Yeah, I guess the delegates painted a picture of Mexico, and maybe when some families arrived, it wasn't the picture that they had visualized for them, and I guess that some took it to heart and then went back. But I believe most of the families and the community stayed because they believed in the idea of preserving this education model. So they knew there were going to be challenges and different aspects that they should resolve. But yeah, maybe some families just didn't see it that way.
I know there's a quote from Isaac M. Dyck, the minister in the Old Colony Church. He talks about in his memoir, and I think it was 1960s or 70 that it was published. And he says, he lists all the problems that were happening in the early days and all the difficulties. And he says, even so, we have freedom of conscience here. And so it's worth it. It's worth everything. It's an interesting kind of perspective on the difficulties that they did encounter when they first came.
Yep.
We have a question here about technology. How do Mexican Mennonites interact with technology and the constant evolution of technology?
Okay, yeah. Well, technology has been a very interesting topic throughout the years. Nowadays, I would say, specifically with Manitoba Colony, is comfortable with some technology aspects. Transportation, communication, and for a lot of time, light trucks, those were very, very controversial topics. But I believe nowadays most of the colony would be comfortable with some aspects of technology. There are still some very, very conservative communities that still don't allow electrical equipment to be installed in their communities. They don't use any sort of transportation other than the buggies and the horses. But those are more radical communities. I believe the Manitoba Colony and the Swift Colony also are already more open to including technology as a positive thing in our life. Still with a lot of being very careful of how we use it, but most of the community would already be open to using these aspects of technology.
I was very interested when I saw the corridor. It reminded me a lot of Steinbach. So if folks have seen Steinbach, Highway 12 going in, the implement dealers, lots of pickup trucks. It's very clear farming is a major concern there. But
Okay.
that was very interesting to me.
Okay.
Somebody is asking here, Barry is asking, are the Mennonites in Mexico adding value to agricultural products in addition to cheese? Do they process apples and cotton or just sell them as commodities?
Okay. I think most of the farmers would sell them as commodities, as a crop. I guess there could be certain projects where one could say there are adding an extra value to the production, but most of the production is just selling the commodities as is. Yeah.
Okay, and another question here. We have so many questions. People are very interested in Mennonite life in
I'm
Manitoba
glad.
Colony. So Dan Jansen asks, as families grow and new generations come along, is there sufficient land so that young people can begin farming? Or are young would-be farmers preventing from getting started as farmers, so have to go into other forms of economic activity?
I guess that's also a detail going back to the question of why did some families go back to Canada. My family isn't into agriculture, but I know a lot of families are, and it is always a topic of how they would acquire land, because normally the children will inherit the land of their parents. So as families grow and land gets divided, it gets smaller and smaller. So yeah, that's always a topic where agricultural land is divided. And then if you wanted to have, again, what maybe your parents had, you had to buy it apart, like from what you inherited. And it's also an economic challenge. So I guess that's also one of the reasons why many sought land, or cheaper land maybe, in Canada.
Okay.
Or even credit. Like, well, Mexico has a very positive agricultural credit policy, but maybe I don't know in detail if Canada has a better one. Maybe that could be it. Okay. And yeah, it's always a challenge in terms of land when it gets inherited through generations. It just gets smaller, or even bigger with the help of the kids. It goes both ways. Okay. it could grow or it could decrease. I guess it depends on the family, but I know a lot of families have had challenges with the amount of land that they can cultivate.
Okay. And, we're getting close to 8 o'clock here. So a few questions about the 100th anniversary celebrations. What does that look like? How are you celebrating in Cuauhtémoc? Are there ways that Canadians can tune into some of those, or Canadians, North Americans, anyone who isn't there? What can you share with us about what your plans are?
Sure, we're very excited. We have 2 more weeks till the festivities. And yes, there's a couple of events that people in Canada or that aren't around in Mexico for that time could watch. The first one is the 10th, which is the opening event. That will be transmitted live through YouTube. Right after the end of the opening act, there will be a parade of agricultural equipment, buggies, transportation methods. So very, very interesting. That would also be transmitted live, and that's also the 10th. The inauguration is at 10, so maybe the parade starts at 11:30. That will be transmitted live. And the third event that will be transmitted live is a church service with members of all churches, organized by the Mennonite Conference in Mexico, which will be transmitted Sunday, the 14th at 2 p.m.
Okay.
Those are, I believe, those are the 3 main live events that we will have.
Okay.
Other than that, if people can come to Mexico and participate, physically, that is also the invitation. People can visit our website. It's www.aniversario Mennonitas. I'll share my screen and then people can.
And you can maybe also put the web address in the chat as I'm kind of wrapping up. Maybe sharing that link would be something people would be interested in.
Yeah. So this is the website of the anniversary, and this is where most of the activities and events would be posted.
Okay.
We also have an Instagram account, Facebook account where people can follow. And yeah, if people can't come, we plan on also sharing videos of the different events. Like we have these 3 that I talked about in live mode, but from the rest of the events and activities, there is videos that will be posted afterwards in our social media and website.
Okay. Well, that's wonderful. Thank you so much for sharing that with us. Just get to my closing here. I know it's a very busy time for you, so thank you so much on behalf of MHV, CTMS, and the PLET Foundation, and everybody on tonight's webinar for taking the time out. I know with 2 weeks coming to a major event, it's a big thing to take time out. So thanks for joining us, Kevin.
Yeah, gladly. Thank you for the invitation. I'm honored to be part of the series, and yeah, thank you.
Awesome. So for people who have watched tonight but maybe missed the first episode that we had in the Leaving Canada Speaker Series, just a reminder that past events are posted on the CTMS and MHV YouTube channels, so you can just Google that. And we have more events like this coming up each month from now until October. So our next event in the series will be on August 30th at 7 p.m. Central Daylight Time. And this one will be a bit special in our series because it will be in person, taking place at Mennonite Heritage Village in Steinbach, Manitoba. We will be screening a brand new documentary on this topic produced by Refuge 31 Films entitled Conform, the Mennonite Migration to Mexico. So for people who might be familiar with their other projects, like the Last Objectors, about conscientious objectors during the Second World War, or the film Volendam about the exodus of European Mennonite refugees aboard the Volendam ship in the late 1940s. You'll know Andrew Wall, the director of those documentaries, does great work. So we're really excited to bring you this first look at his brand new film. The screening will be hosted by Royden Lowen, and Andrew Wall will be on hand to talk about the film and take your questions. So we're really excited about this. Registration is now open on the CTMS website for this event. So register, mark your calendars, and we'll see you at MHV on August 30th. Looking ahead a little further, we'll be back online for our September event for this series, where I'll be presenting on the unique role of the Steinbach Post, a small town newspaper that, with the migration to Mexico in 1922, became a transnational bridge between Mennonite communities scattered across the Americas. That event will take place September 27th at 7 p.m., again, Central Daylight Time, and registration will open on the CTMS website in August. So keep an eye on your inboxes for more details in the coming weeks. And we've also heard reports that some of our emails with the webinar links are going into your junk mail folders. So make sure to check your junk mail if you're missing the email. This speaker series is based on the exhibit Leaving Canada, the Mennonite Migration to Mexico, which is on display at MHV now until November 30th. So we hope to see you at the museum over the summer to take that in. But for those further afield, we're already working on an online version of the exhibit. So we plan to launch that in late summer or early fall, so you can stay tuned for an opportunity to enjoy the exhibit that way as well. Once again, thank you to Kevin for his presentation this evening, taking all our questions. Sorry to folks who didn't have their questions answered. We had a lot of them coming in, but hopefully we gave you a good sense of what Mennonite life is and has been like in Mexico. We look forward to seeing you in person at MHV on August 30th for our next installment in the series. Have a great night, everyone.
Thank you.
Bye.